when it comes to faults, flaws and taints, things aren't always black or white. So if a wine's not right, you say it's faulty. If it's something to do with the winemaking, if it's something that's been picked up from elsewhere, it's a taint. So if you get a wine that smells of the stables, the horse manure, or even the Band-Aid, that is something that's been metabolized in the wine by yeast. A wine that is corked is nothing to do with the wine. The wine picks up the off odours from an external source. It may well be from the cork, but it's actually nothing to do with the actual wine making. So in theory, we should say that wine's tainted, not faulty. But in practice, we don't.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 268. How can you tell when a wine is mildly corked versus you just don't like it? What are the main types of wine faults and how can you identify them? And why are inexpensive wines actually less prone to faults? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in our chat with Keith Grainger, author of Wine Faults and Flaws, a Practical Guide, which won the coveted 2022 Prix Dove. One of you is going to win a personally signed copy of his terrific hardcover book that retails for $220. It's the definitive guide on the subject. Just a note that I still have a copy of Amanda Barnes' beautiful hardcover book, The South American Wine Guide, to give away. All you need to do is email me and let me know you'd like to win Amanda or Keith's books, or both. I'll choose someone randomly from those who contact me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. If you haven't got your copy of Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much yet, and would like to support it and this podcast that I do for you on a volunteer basis and ensure it continues, please order it from any online book retailer now, no matter where you live. It usually arrives within a day or two, and of course the ebook is instant. Every little bit helps spread the message in this book of hope, justice, and resilience. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/268. If you've read the book or are reading it, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. If you have any suggestions on how to improve this podcast, please let me know. I'm also on a mission right now to find and review the best low and no alcohol wines, mixed drinks, spirits, and beers on the market. I've discovered some wonderful surprises, so I'll include a link in the show notes with the ones I've found so far. I'd love to hear from you if you have any brands to recommend that I try. Okay, on with the show. Keith Grainger is an award-winning wine writer, educator, and consultant to the wine industry. He is the author of Wine Faults and Flaws, a Practical Guide, which won the coveted 2022 Prix de Louvre, I think. His previous book was Wine Production and Quality, co-authored with Hazel Tattersall, and that won the Gourmand Award for the best wine book in the world for professionals and is mandatory or recommended reading for many wine courses, including university enology programs. And he joins us now about an hour and a half north of his home in London because he's apparently doing some child minding. Welcome, Keith. We're so glad you're here with us.
Hello, Natalie. Hello, everybody.
Yes.
Great to be among some wine lovers.
Excellent, excellent. I should note that you are not a part-time nanny. You're actually minding your son's children, right?
That's correct,
Yeah, okay.
yes. Can I just add, in addition to the roles which you stated,
Yes.
author, wine writer, I also do consultant winemaking. Used to be in South Africa.
Okay.
I haven't been there since COVID, but still working in Turkey and Cyprus.
Oh, okay. So are you one of those flying winemakers that comes in and advises, sort of thing?
I wouldn't give myself such an illustrious hat. The flying winemakers, tend to spend most of their time on the phone and driving around in their Porsche.
Oh, I see.
I can
No
be
Porsche?
quite hands-on. Yes.
Okay.
I can be quite hands-on, so I'm not afraid to get dirty and actually to say things as they are rather than as the client might wish them to be.
Excellent. That sounds far more practical. And of course, you're good at finding faults in the first place, so I'm sure your advice would be indispensable. All right, so let's jump right in, Keith. In a nutshell, what is this Wine Faults and Flaws book about, aside from the obvious, of course? What makes it different from perhaps anything else that's been written on this topic, and why would we find it useful?
Okay, let me show you the book first of all.
Okay, there it is.
Okay,
Wow,
just move it
look
back
at that.
a bit, so
Yes.
it should be on the screen.
And for
If you
those who
like,
are,
you can block me out. That's far more attractive.
those who are listening on
go.
the podcast, we will put a link to this in the show notes. And
Thank
so,
you.
yes, how many pages are in there?
528.
It's a substantial book.
Yeah, pretty big. Weighs well over 1 kilo.
Okay.
It is big. It's available in hardback and as an ebook. It is actually available on Kindle, but why anyone would buy this on Kindle, God only knows. So I'd probably recommend the hardback and maybe even the ebook if you like to search for things.
Sure.
So what's it about? Well, a detailed discussion of wine faults. That's pretty obvious.
Mm-hmm.
We look at each fault, sort of what it is in basic terms. So a lot of misunderstanding just on the use of words. How you can detect the fault, how you can detect it, the wine in your glass, by seeing for some faults, by smelling others, and obviously by tasting for other faults. Some faults you can see, some you can smell, some you can only taste. Also look at how you can detect a fault by laboratory analysis, which probably for our viewers is not that important. But let me say, this book is a bridge between a readable book and a scientific book. Most wine people don't read scientific books. They're too technical. It's hard to understand.
Sure.
Scientists speak their own language all the time. And most scientists don't read wine writers' books. They find them too full of anecdotes, not enough rigour, etc.
Sure.
I've tried to do a bridge between the two. So to do a highly readable book, but something which contains detailed science for those who want it. So for the faults, we look at what stage of production can it occur.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe during winemaking, maybe even in the vineyard before the winemaking, sometimes in maturation, sometimes in storage. Look at how the fault might be prevented. This is of interest even for the wine lover, because
Sure.
poor storage can bring on some faults. Whether a affected wine is treatable by the professionals in the winery or even by the consumer at home. Perhaps a little trick I might give you later on how to treat one of the faults.
Yes.
I say the detailed science, and really someone said, if it's not in this book about wine faults, you probably don't want or need to know.
Oh, that's good. So comprehensive and yet, as you say, readable, and it keeps you going, because you have some great stories, which we're going to dive into. So what drew you to this story? Why wine faults? I mean, in a world of other topics, what intrigued you about this particular area, Keith?
It's funny, just a couple of months ago, a colleague of mine died, a guy called Trevor Elliott, who was a great wine writer and educator, also author to my mind of the best book on the wines of Madeira. That was his area of expertise. Trevor and I were in Bordeaux, and we're going back now almost 20 years, and we were both together at the same sit-down seminar, presentation, masterclass, whatever we wanted to call it, which was looking at some basic Bordeaux wines that carried the appellation Bordeaux and or Bordeaux Superior. And wines were presented, they were in front of us on the table. When the wines were first poured, we both gave a bit of a look to each other, But when we came to the second wine, picked up the glass and immediately got that nose of mushroom, damp sack, dry rot, all the symptoms of what we normally refer to as corked wine. Trevor and I looked at each other exactly the same time and thought, God, this wine is so badly cooked, as we would say, as to be totally undrinkable. So I never like to make a fuss when these things happen. So I just sidled out of my chair and went up to the front bench where the panel was sitting and to the maker of the wine and said, do you want to have a nose of this? In my best French, which isn't that great. And he sniffed the wine and said, "C'est parfait, monsieur. Not a problem."
You are wrong.
So I said not a word. I saw the scowls from other tasting participants, but realised, of course, that even professionals often have a lot to learn about wine faults. One of the things that does happen, of course, is winemakers get partially desensitized to certain faults, partial osmotics. It's very tricky. If you're in a cellar that's got a bit of one of the compounds that gives cork taint, TCA, in there, you get used to it and you don't smell it on your wines.
Wow. It's like wearing the same perfume too long. You accommodate to it.
You've got it.
Yeah.
So it's a problem. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Manchuela in Spain. There's an article on my website on this. And I'll say straight away, this was a sponsored visit. So I tried to write positively, but there was one winery I went to, which I didn't write about at all. The organisers came back and said, "Oh, you haven't written about so-and-so and so-and-so." I said, yeah, because one step in the building, there was haloanesols, the technical name for the cork taint.
Okay.
And if that is in the building, the chances are it's going to get in a lot of the wines. There's no way I want my readers tasting these faulty wines.
Wow. Yeah. So that's what tipped you in the direction of this book. You wanted to explore the whole, not just corked, but other types of things when bad wine happens to good people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the point is that if you buy a car and there's something wrong with it, you send it back. If it's minor, you try and get it fixed. If it's major, you ask for another car. Anything else, if you buy a TV, a computer or something, and it's substantially faulty, you don't bear with it, you send it back.
Sure.
Now, there's probably a higher incidence of faults in wines than there are in pretty much every other, I'm going to say, consumer good. You know what I mean? A lot of the time people don't know, they don't recognise it. If they do, a lot of the time they think, oh, I'm not going to make a fuss, I'll bear with it. Now, if you're in a wine that's costing, sort of $10, $15 or so a bottle, fine. Okay, that's a small price to pay. But if you're into buying fine wines and it's not right, you are getting ripped off.
Yes. Yeah. Becomes more serious issue for sure. Now, the story you just told, was the wine itself faulty or was there something else at play, perhaps with the stemware?
No, it's definitely the wine.
It was the wine.
That is faulty.
Okay.
We might talk later about issues that there can be with stemware and how it's been washed. But in that case, it was the wine itself. And I did check by chipping into a glass, which I nosed to make sure it was clean.
Right.
And the fault was well and truly still there.
Okay. So what was the most surprising thing that you discovered while you were writing this book?
I am a practical sort of guy and I like things to be black and white. Fairly early into my research, I discovered that when it comes to faults, flaws and taints, things aren't always black and white. Let me just at this point, I use the word fault and taint, and I should distinguish between them. Most of us don't. So if a wine's not right, you say it's faulty. Mm-hmm. In theory, if it's something to do with the winemaking, it's a fault. If it's something that's been picked up from elsewhere, it's a taint. So if you get a wine that smells of the stables, the horse manure, etc., or even the Band-Aid, okay, that is something that's been metabolized in the wine by yeast, which are the myces we might get a chance to talk about. On the other hand, a wine that is corked, as we've just been looking at, in fact, it's nothing to do with the wine. The wine picks up the off odours, the off taste from an external source. Now, in the case of the corked wine, it may well be from the cork. It might not be, something else we'll look at. But it's actually nothing to do with the actual winemaking. So in theory, we should say that wine's tainted, not faulty. But in practice, we don't. So I, generally speaking, just talk about faulty wines.
Yeah, it's good to know the difference, though. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but back to the hardest thing is that the boundary in many cases between a wine that's in good condition and one that's faulted is very soft, it's very broad. Now, not in the case of corked wine. And I'm going to say it's probably the last time I'm actually going to use that term. I'm going to say halo anisole tainted.
Okay.
And the reason I'm doing that is because the fault might not be caused by the cork. It could be caused by other factors. But if a wine then is halo anisole tainted, it is always faulty. Doesn't matter what level, it is always faulty.
Okay.
On the other hand, a wine that shows some signs of Brett aromas, Brett taste, the compounds metabolized by this rogue yeast, Brettanomyces, may or may not be faulty depending on the level of compounds in the wine. So this one might be acceptable, that one might not be. And the same with some other faults we look at. One we may or may not get a chance to discuss is TDN. When you get that petrol, kerosene, diesel note in a Riesling wine, particularly an aged Riesling, many people regard that as a sign of a good quality wine. But once it goes over a certain boundary, the wine then becomes undrinkable. So a lot of the time it really is a matter of levels of the compounds equals boundaries as we taste the wine.
Right.
Yeah, just on this, something else that I learned as well is that this sounds crazy and it's very rare. Faulty wines can be paradoxically excellent.
Oh,
and
how so? Tell us.
Yeah, I'm going to give an example of a wine I've been fortunate in tasting twice in my life and maybe I'll never taste again. Many people, they've been asked, I'm talking wine writers, critics, been asked to say, what's the best wine you've ever tasted, the best wine of all time? One wine and vintage comes up quite a few times. It's Chateau Cheval Blanc, 1947. So we're going back a fair few years now.
Yes.
This wine is technically faulty. It's got volatile acidity that is through the roof.
And volatile acidity, how would that smell to the layperson?
Let's just say simply vinegar.
Vinegar, okay.
Or particularly balsamic rather than sort of a spirit vinegar.
Okay.
Now, sometimes, like on an Italian wine, many Italian wines have quite high levels of volatile acidity. And that is part of their Italian-ness, shall we say. But normally in a Bordeaux, it is well and truly undesirable. So this Cheval Blanc 47 is so complex, it's a wine of the heart, a wine of the soul. But not only has it got volatile acidity through the roof, it's got residual sugar, it's got all sorts of things. If it were made today, the winemaking team would be sacked. There's no doubt about it. They'd be out of the door. So it's very sad to think that, well, many people say the best wine of all time could never be made again. And let me just very quickly give one more example. Nicolas Joly, many of the wine lovers from the Loire Valley know very well. Nicolas Joly is a pretty crazy guy. He's biodynamic. Winemakers and oenologues, tend not to have a kind word to say about him. People who love his wines think he's absolute god. And I'm just going to give a tasting note from Lisa Perotti Brown of the 2005 vintage of Nicolas Joly Clos de la Bergerie Savennier or Moine.
Okay.
And she says, this wine, ethyl acetate, that's a fault. Acetaldehyde, a fault. High volatile acidity, a fault. Along with beautiful, rich, mature fruit, the wine tastes delicious.
Wow. Way to go with the contradictions. Yeah. And is he also, Nicolas Joly, into natural wines? It's biodynamic, but the whole natural, don't intervene and don't add anything.
Exactly.
Okay.
He keeps his cell phone well away from his wine.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But it's interesting, actually, because let me say that my background when I left school is arts. I wanted to be a classical musician, and I was pretty damn good in the small town and county where I was brought up. I then went to music college in London and realised that I was crap, that I would never be in the first division. And in classical music, if you're not in the first division, you're not anywhere at all. So I had the good sense to say, right, let's not pursue this. Although I did spend a few years in record production on pop music of all things. But just going forward from that, I learnt my science as I started learning my wine. So many winemakers oenologues, their background is a first-class honours degree in organic chemistry. Mine isn't. I had to learn all that as I went along, did lots of courses, but because in many ways I regard myself as an artist, I look at wine from an artist's point of view. So I think when we look at these faults again, scientists pinpoint it down to the numbers, the compounds, etc. To the wine lover, in some ways that's unimportant. It's how the wine tastes in the glass.
Yes.
Is it actually enjoyable?
The whole picture.
So when we come to people like Nicolas Joly and his biodynamics and his creativeness, the scientists, i.e. the people who got their first class honours degree and the PhD in various aspects of organic chemistry, they will poo-poo all this natural wine. So will the botanists. They will poo-poo biodynamics. There's a quite interesting book by a professor of viticulture at UC Davis, Mark Matthews, called Terroir and Other Myths of Wine Growing. And Mark dismisses biodynamic in about half a page.
Wow. What's his issue with it?
It's not scientific.
Oh, I see. Okay.
To put it very, very simple. And of course, Mark actually dismisses in not quite so few words the whole concept of terroir, soil, minerality coming into wines. And I'm just putting this in a very, very quick précis. But what I'm trying to say is that, so he would dismiss biodynamics, he would dismiss Nicolas Joly, but you cannot argue that biodynamics can produce stunning wines. Domaine de Romani-Conti, Domaine Loire, Chateau Pontet, Canet, Bordeaux, Chapoutier, the Rhone, go on and on and on. Yes. So just because it can't be explained by science, to my mind, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Exactly. And even if it's not the actual bearing of the bull's horns and the chamomile tea, at least the winemaker is paying close attention to those vines through all of the biodynamic practices and getting away from, herbicides, pesticides.
Yeah, I agree, spot on.
Yeah.
I'd often question, is this wine great because A, it's biodynamic, or B, because of the attention to detail that the winemakers make. I will say, just going back to our friend Nicolas Joly in the Loire, he once said to me, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here, Keith, he says, you talk about winemaker. I don't know the meaning of the word. What is a winemaker? The wine is made in the vineyard, and all we do is convert that into something that is delicious.
Yep. Another sort of zealous, not zealot, but zealous pronouncement. So what is the weirdest wine fault you've ever heard of, or that we've not heard of, that would surprise us?
Right. I'm not going to try and be technical. It always shut me up when I get technical. It's probably the fault of mousiness. Mousiness, which is a lactic acid fault. I'm not going to pronounce the chemical compound responsible. I'm just going to give you the acronym, which is ATHP, and another one ETHP. But mousiness is a very strange one because you don't normally pick it up when you're smelling it, smelling the wine. It manifests itself on the palate, and particularly the back palate. So what I'm saying is the compounds responsible are not volatile, not ones you normally smell.
In the air,
But you get it after the wine's been swallowed or after it's been spat, and the saliva in the mouth has diluted the acid of the wine and therefore raised the pH. And the flavours, mouse urine, now we're not normally used to tasting that. I've got a house in France. It's an old, what they call cour de ferme, the heart of a farm. We've always got mice. I try to keep the house as clean as possible, but we're in the country and mice get in, full stop. So you learn that mouse smell pretty quickly, that smell of a dirty mouse cage. The nearest we get in something which we're perhaps used to tasting is popcorn. So particularly noticeable on the back palate, on the finish of the wine. Sometimes get a bit of a hint of dried sausage skins, salami, sometimes a bit of a hint of vomit, or even just dirty kitchen mops. So quite a few ways it can manifest itself.
So unappetizing. This is another reason why we are not tasting wines today. We can't have this whole discussion and then, let's turn to, wow, those are very unusual kinds of aromas. Thank God they're not prevalent, or at least as prevalent as, say, TCA fault.
Yes.
So can we generalize a bit? Can faults sort of fall into two categories, those that are caused by bacteria versus those that are caused by sulfur compounds?
Not quite that simple, actually,
Okay,
but
trying.
you're on the right track. Okay. Sulfur we know as a chemical.
Yes.
So let's include the faults caused by sulfur compounds as chemical faults.
Okay.
Bacteria, of course, are in the realms of microbiology.
Right.
So let's say we've got chemical faults and microbiological faults. One other thing we can get, of course, is a physical fault. Let's look at something quite simple. If you open a wine and you find there's some contamination in there, an insect's got in, or some bits of grit or treaded bits of glass or something.
Okay.
That's something I don't really discuss in the book in any depth, because you can find that in any food industry. One of the commonest causes of food products being recalled is contamination with something, or from machines or something like that. But when it comes to the wine itself, chemical or microbiological.
Okay. And are inexpensive wines, say, let's just have an arbitrary cutoff, under $20, are they more prone to having faults in general than expensive wines?
No.
Nope.
Anything I say, it's the other way around. The reason is quite simple. Inexpensive wines, and I've got nothing against them, drink them quite often, are what I will call factory wines, generally speaking. The economics are not there for them to be produced by an artisan, by a small producer.
Okay.
So factory wines, normally the winery, wine factory, whatever you call it, is pretty well equipped. Quite often they've got their own laboratory, they've got their own technicians on hand, and they are checking the wines all the time. So in fact, faulty wines are more likely to be found in high-end wines, artisan wines, especially when people want to do wine as natural as possible, or not use the word natural wine just for a minute, but let's say keep sulfur dioxide levels as low as possible, perhaps not filtering the wine. Now, Robert Parker, of course, was always totally adverse to wine filtration, felt that it's very detrimental to quality. I would probably agree with him, but not in all circumstances. But many potential hazards, potential faults, can be excluded by fine filtration. So Britannomyces, as we mentioned already, probably look at again, is something which, if you filter the wine through a sterile filter, the fault is much less likely to happen.
Okay, I didn't know that. Wow. So let's go back to the whole, I'm going to call it corked because I cannot pronounce what you're saying, but for all intents, you can talk your language, I'll talk mine. So it's correct if anything is wrong here, but it's when a fungus interacts with the chemical used to sanitize corks and produces the chemical TCA, the acronym for 2,4,6-trichloronolysis. Oh boy. Yeah, I should not try. I should not try. But as you said, we can recognize corked wines by their musty, mildewy, I always think of an old attic Roman flavor. So is it true that about 5% of bottles are corked?
Okay, let me answer that question first, and then I'll come back to your
definition, my faulty definition.
Yeah, exactly. 5%. That probably was the case in the 1990s and maybe even in the early 2000s.
Okay.
Not so now.
All right.
There was a huge so-called cork taint crisis in the 1990s, and the cork industry realised it really had to get its act together because it was losing the market. So particularly Australia and New Zealand, the producers say, hang on a minute, if we're getting far too many dodgy corks from you guys, we're going to turn to alternative closures. Many producers initially went on to synthetic cork-like stoppers, so-called Supreme cork. Particularly in Australia and New Zealand, they went on to screw cap. So the cork industry had perhaps been a little bit arrogant during the 1990s. People had to buy cork to close their wine. Then it was realised they didn't. So they started getting their act together, and a huge investment in R&D since then. Absolutely massive. So I would say today the incidence of cork wines is probably more like 0.5%, but it does vary from country to country, region to region, and in some cases, yes, there is a high incidence, but even 0.5% is too high. I mean, the aim is to get it down to zero, obviously. But let me just go back to your introduction as to how the taint is caused. It's caused. That was a nice slip of the tongue. I'm going to say straight away, you would probably never have found a corked wine, as we refer to it today, before the Second World War. Now, People wrote about corked wine. There's a famous English writer called George Saintsbury, who did a book called Notes on a Cellar Book in the 1920s, and he refers to a wine being corked. But what he was referring to is pretty definitely not what we think of the corked wine today, that musty taste, that dry rot, mushrooms, damp sack, etc. It was probably something else in the cork, because the cork problem and cork taint problem started just after the Second World War. We can blame our friends in the agrochemical, petrochemical industry. They started manufacturing pesticides and herbicides that were based on chlorophenols. We don't need to know what they are particularly, but also bromophenols. Think of chlorine for chlorophenol and bromine for bromophenol.
Okay.
These herbicides, pesticides start getting made. Dow, Monsanto were manufacturing. Now, let us not put blame here for a minute. Let's say quite often people first move into something, they don't know the problems that will ensue in years' time.
Sure.
But what happened then is that chlorophenols and bromophenols became airborne. Chlorophenol, by the action of fungi, particularly filamentous fungi, those things that throw out little filaments, those fungi will convert chlorophenol into chloroanisole, or TCA, and bromophenol into bromoanisole, so-called TBA. Now, that started getting, airborne. The trees in the cork forests in Portugal and Spain, they were picking up the chlorophenols. The fungi in the bark would convert it into chloroanisols, and thus the problem really got going. It was getting larger and larger from the 1970s, 80s, and probably peaked in the 1990s. The cork industry's changed its practices, well overdue, so a lot of research. The top-end cork producers now have processes that can guarantee that there is no detectable TCA in the cork. I do say detectable because it can be there below detection threshold, and they actually give the wineries who buy corks on them that guarantee. Okay. The problem with that, of course, is those corks cost a fortune, and you're not going to get them, as you say, your $15 bottle of wine, because the cork itself costs over $1.
Oh, okay. Okay. Wow. Interesting.
So that's the background.
Yeah.
So one thing to consider just here then is that if the compounds are present in the cork, they can migrate into the wine.
Right.
But you can get so-called cork wines, back to my haloanisole word, that have never seen a cork in the bottle. Where I was in Bordeaux when my colleague and I were tasting these wines, it probably wasn't a cork problem. It almost certainly was a winery problem. I say that because I actually visited the property in question a year later, walked through the door and, oh yes, I remember that wine. Straight there.
Wow.
Now, I want to just look briefly at two areas. California, very familiar to you, and Bordeaux, very familiar to me. During the 1960s, 70s, Bordeaux was starting to pick itself up after World War II. 61 was a great vintage, 66 was pretty good. 82, of course, if we go forward a bit, fantastic vintage. Lots of wineries started reinvesting. The buildings had been crumbling, they were not in the best of states, which in some ways you think is not good. But it turned out that the reinvestment wasn't good, because quite often they were having lots of the timber work taken out and new timber put in.
Okay.
The timbers were treated with bromophenols, back to where I was. So immediately then, these start getting converted by filamentous fungi and come into the wines. And I think I can name these without any risk of you or I getting sued. There were some big problems in Bordeaux in the late 1980s, early 90s. Chateau du Cru Bacayou, for example, the contamination of their chai, their cellar, was so bad they had to have it pulled down and entirely rebuilt.
Wow.
There are problems with Chateau Canon, Chateau Latour, etc. Big, big problems. One of the things with Bordeaux as well, the way the system works, is that They were, and still are to a degree, detached from the market. The wines would be sold by brokers into what's called the Place de Bordeaux. In other words, they would never see a customer.
Huh.
And it's only when people started writing about things and reports start getting back, and they shrugged their shoulders, of course, and pas de problème, monsieur, again. But when, person after person started saying this, that they started to act. Now, of course, it wasn't just Bordeaux, many other wine regions, and California, number sellers suffered in the 1990s. Hansel, Heinz, and not that long after they did so well in the Judgment of Paris, Chateau Montelena had big problems with TCA contamination. These were picked up by some writers, initially dismissed, but when the technical team went to the cellars, they found the problems. So then they had to start taking out woodwork, shaving off barrels, all sorts of things. I must say California generally today is pretty clean. And all the wineries I've mentioned, I must say once again, they are ultra clean cellars and back in top form.
Oh, that's a good thing. Wow. So although the incidence of corked bottles has diminished, I think you were talking in another interview where it was either corked wines or all faulted wines. You estimate it could be costing the industry anywhere from $1 billion to $10 billion. What was that about?
Yeah, the 10 billion figure is spread over a number of years, actually, and is from research papers. In fact, that's spread over 8 years and going back a few years. But even today, researchers on behalf of the European Union estimate that the haloanisole contamination, the corked wines, is probably costing 700 million euros a year. So trying to figure
it's over $1 billion, for sure.
Exactly.
When you translate it, absolutely. And I found it fascinating because you made some analogies that how minuscule amount of quirkiness it takes to ruin a wine. So one was about wheat. What was that analogy?
Okay, just the scientific 5 seconds before we go into that. For a corked wine, the compound are so volatile that a tiny amount, i.e. just over 1 part per trillion, will have a tainted wine that you can taste. So my analogy back to wheat is that would be the equivalent of 1 grain of wheat in 100,000 tonnes, or 1 cube of sugar in 60 Olympic-sized swimming pools.
Wow.
It's been estimated, not by me, that a couple of tablespoonful of this taint is enough to cause a problem in all the wines in the world.
Jeez. Oh my goodness. That's incredible. Wow. And yet you add too that cork can absorb some of the bad smell. So does that help, or is it still masking the problem in not a good way?
This is interesting. I'm reasonably friendly with some of the technical guys at Amarim, who are the largest cork producer in the world. I'd say reasonably friendly. Obviously, when I've been doing research, you've got to get into these guys so you can understand the way they work. And Paulo Lopez, technical director, always says that servers, waiters, sommeliers, when drawing the cork from a bottle, will often smell the cork.
Right.
And if the wine smells at all musty or taint, they will reject the wine. But it can be that the wine itself was cork tainted, but the cork has absorbed the taint from the wine. So it's like a blotting paper.
Right.
So what we normally look at is you need to sort of dissect the entire cork. If it smells musty at the wine end, it's probably come from the wine. If it smells musty through the cork or even at the top end away from the wine, it's probably been a cork problem. That's been ultra simplistic.
Sure. And do screw caps eliminate your risk of your wine being corked? I guess you said it can come from other sources, so not, right?
They substantially reduce the risk, that there's no doubt. But yes, if it's present in the wine, so it's come from a contaminated winery, you can still get it. And I've found numerous incidences of wine sealed with a screw cap, which have got the haloanisole taint in there.
Right. And you've talked about this, and as have I in the past. And, a corked wine is so damaging to a winery's reputation because someone who doesn't know the wine can open it. It smells like a musty attic, and they think, I just don't like this wine. They're not a good winemaker. So how can we tell when a wine is mildly corked and just sort of depressing the aromas a bit, because it is on a spectrum, versus this wine just isn't really aromatic or doing much?
Okay, first of all, the damage to reputation can be very real.
Yes.
And of course, you or I, and I'm sure most of your listeners would better say straight away if the wine is so-called corked. But the general consumer, they may think, I don't like this wine. This is a rubbish wine.
Yes.
This is a cracked wine. I'm not going to buy any more of this bottle, or I'm not going to buy any more from this producer even. And imagine how cheated you feel when you've got wines in your cellar you've been carefully nurturing for the last 15, 20 years maybe, and you open the bottle, it's called, excuse me, bugger me, you know.
Never again, exactly.
Never again, exactly.
Yeah.
So the damage that can be done, and I suppose as with all faults, especially today, you know, with podcasts, blogs, etc., nothing is talked about as much as wine. There's no other food product, no other drink that is discussed quite as much as wine. So the word gets round in seconds.
Yep, it's quite the grapevine, yep.
That there's a problem here. But to the other part of your question, though, how do you know if it's a low-level taint? Well, sometimes you don't. These TCA compounds and TBA compound, if it affects a wine at a very low level, you don't get the mustiness, you don't get the damp sack, you don't get the mushrooms, you don't get the dry rot. But the wine will taste flat, as though somebody's been sucking all the aromas, all the flavours out of the wine. And this, of course, is a big problem to the industry, because if it's a high-level taint, then people may well complain. But if it's a low level, then almost everyone is just saying, oh, nothing much to this wine, it is under-delivering, well and truly. So that is when they really fear the problem. Back to my friends at Amarin again, they do say that the TCA problem is not going to go away. But as far as cork's concerned, the problem is getting diminished. But the problem is always there through aerial contamination. And let me just say, it's not just wine it affects. So many other things. It affects water.
Tap water. How does it affect tap water? Your water will taste like a musty attic?
Yeah, spot on. I mean, two things there to consider. Firstly, of course, that tap water is very often chlorinated. Chlorine, of course, back to my chlorophenol, is one of the sources of TCA. Back to my little visit to the winery in Spain just a few weeks ago. As soon as I walked in through the door, not only did I smell mustiness, I smelled chlorine, which they were using as a cleaner. A winery should never, ever, ever use chlorine as a cleaner. You know, big mistake. So it can get in the water from chlorine, water being chlorinated, but also, of course, more and more nowadays, water comes through plastic pipes. Plastic, of course, have got phenols in, so once again, the contamination can come from the pipes. It is a growing problem.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Keith. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, Keith was very helpful in his discussion of one of the main flaws of wine when it's corked, especially when it's only mildly so. As he mentioned, if it affects a wine at a very low level, you don't get the mustiness and mushrooms or dry rot, but the wine will taste flat, as though somebody's been sucking all the aromas and flavors out of it. This is a big problem for the industry. Number 2, Keith had a terrific way not only of describing the main faults of wine, but also how you identify them. He was precise without being overly technical. He summarized them as falling under 3 categories. Number 1, microbial, number 2, chemical, and number 3, physical. Each fault is caused by different agents, and each has characteristics that can be smelled, tasted, and or identified visually. And finally, number 3, I was surprised to learn that inexpensive wines are actually less prone to faults, but Keith's explanation makes sense as to why that's so. They're produced in a more factory-type manner as opposed to the artisan wines and natural wines, which have more room for error at the higher end. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with Keith, links to his website and books, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. You'll also find a link to take a free online food and wine pairing class with me called the 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemclean.com/class. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/268. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or if you've read my book or are in the process of reading it at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'd love to hear from you. If you missed episode 96, go back and take a listen. I chat with Janice Beaton about pairing white wine with blue cheese, which of course is injected with the good type of mold, not the faulty kind. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
A sweet wine and a blue cheese, they're made for each other. The acidity, that's a very important element as well with the blue cheese. So I think that the stone fruit, the sort of tropical nature, the sweetness, it stood up so well. I was very impressed.
It does. It works very well. And I wouldn't have thought about this pairing either, because this is such a light, beautiful wine that I would think of for an aperitif. But it does work. It's got that off-dry, the acidity. It actually holds its own.
You know, we both agreed it's refreshing, it's light. And that was my concern. I often think weight when I pair, and this is not a weighty wine in the way that this is a weighty cheese. So I thought it might just knock it over and really sort of gallop over the top of it. And it didn't at all. So Very pleasantly surprised.
You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Keith. If you liked this episode, please email or tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines, tips, and stories we shared. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie McClain Wine on their favorite podcast app. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a delicious, flawless wine. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.